Damien Cross had not felt his hands shake in 25 years, and it took nothing more than 7 ordinary words from a tired waitress to bring it back. The diner sat on a quiet stretch of highway outside the city, the kind of place that stayed open past midnight, mostly out of habit, a handful of booths. A coffee machine that hissed more than it brewed, a bell over the door that hadn't rung with any real urgency in hours. Damien came here rarely, and never for a reason anyone would think to question. Tonight, a meeting 2 miles east had run long and cost him more patience than he liked to spend. And he wanted 10 minutes of ordinary silence before he went home to a house that had never once, in 25 years, felt like anything but a very well-kept museum. He sat at the counter, plain black coat. No watch worth noticing. Nothing about him that announced the kind of man he actually was, though the diner's only waitress. Wiping down the counter with the particular exhaustion of someone 4 hours into a closing shift would not have cared either way. "Coffee, black," Damien said. "Coming up." She didn't look at him twice. Her name tag read Maya, slightly crooked, the pin bent from being clipped on too many times in a hurry. She set the cup down without ceremony, and Damien watched her for a moment longer than the coffee warranted, not out of interest. Simply the old habit of a man who noticed everything in a room out of necessity, rather than curiosity. She was maybe mid-20s, tired in a way that went deeper than one long shift, practical in her movements. The kind of tiredness that came from carrying more than a job. Her phone buzzed once on the counter behind the register. She glanced at it, exhaled, and let it ring out. "Everything all right?" Damien asked, more out of the same old habit than genuine concern. "My mom's neighbor," Maya said, distracted, wiping a spot that didn't need wiping. "Just checking in. My mom's not doing great lately. Hard thing. I try to get home before she goes to sleep so she's not alone too long. But," she gestured vaguely at the empty diner, the late hour, the job that clearly didn't care much for her schedule. "Anyway, sorry. You don't need to hear about that." Damien said nothing, simply nodded, and finished his coffee in silence while she moved down the counter, restocking napkins, cashing out the register. The small and remarkable choreography of a closing shift. When he finally rose to pay, Maya rang him up without much ceremony, counting his change back with quick, practiced fingers. "Have a good night," she said, already turning back toward the register. He was 3 steps from the door when she called after him, almost as an afterthought, her voice carrying the light, unbothered tone of someone making conversation rather than a discovery. "Hey, sorry, random thing." Her eyes had caught on his hand where it rested against the door frame, on the small faded mark he hadn't thought about consciously in years. "Sir, my mother has the same tattoo like yours." Damien went very still. The tattoo was small, old, faded to a soft gray blue with time, a compass rose wrapped tight around a single flame. He did not need to look down at it. He knew its exact shape the way a man knows a scar he's carried since before he learned to stop flinching from it. There was no reason on earth this tattoo should exist anywhere else. He had designed it himself, once in a life he had trained himself for 25 years not to revisit. Only one other person had ever worn its twin. "What did you say?" Damien said, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. Maya blinked, caught off guard by the sudden intensity in a customer who'd said maybe 10 words all evening. "Sorry, I didn't mean anything by it. My mom has this old tattoo, same design, exact same spot on her hand. I used to ask her about it when I was a kid. She never really explained it. I always figured it was just some old trend, or a weird coincidence." Damien turned fully back into the diner, his hand falling slowly away from the door. "Your mother," he said carefully, each word measured, controlled. "What's her name?" "Isabel," Maya said, her brow furrowing now. Some instinct telling her this had stopped being ordinary small talk somewhere in the last 10 seconds. "Isabel Reyes."
Why do you?
Damien did not answer right away. Something moved behind his eyes, brief and contained, gone almost as quickly as it surfaced. The particular stillness of a man hearing a name he had spent 25 years making sure he never said aloud, not to his lieutenants, not to himself, not even in the private hours when sleep refused to come. He crossed back to the counter and sat down slowly on the stool he'd just left. His hands, steady through every negotiation and every quiet, unspoken threat he'd delivered in 25 years of running an empire most men feared to whisper about, trembled faintly against the counter's worn surface. He pressed them flat, willing the stillness back into them the way he trained himself to do decades ago. "Sir?" Maya said, watching him with growing unease. Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. Damien looked up at her, really looked, for the first time, past the tired uniform and the crooked name tag. At the shape of her face, the particular set of her eyes, details he hadn't let himself notice until this exact moment because he'd had no reason to look for them at all. He remembered, without warning, a night 25 years gone, a woman who had been supposed to meet him, who never arrived, who vanished so completely and so suddenly that for years afterward he had told himself there was only one explanation that made any sense. He had never once questioned it closely enough to wonder why a woman who loved him would disappear without a single word, without ever trying to reach him again, not once, not in 25 years. He had never let himself wonder, because wondering had always felt more dangerous than simply believing what he'd been told. How old are you? He asked quietly. Maya's confusion deepened, the question landing strange and much too personal for a stranger at a counter. 24, she said slowly. Why does that matter? Damien sat very still, the diner's fluorescent lights humming softly overhead, the bell over the door silent. The ordinary world outside continuing exactly as it had a moment ago, while inside him, a grief he had buried for 25 years began, without warning, to crack open along a line he had never once let himself examine. 25 years since Isabel had disappeared. 24 years since this girl had been born. He did the math without wanting to, the way a man does math he has spent a quarter of a century avoiding, and felt the floor of his own carefully controlled life tilt beneath him for the first time since the night Isabel Reyes had vanished from it entirely. And for the first time in 25 years, Damien Cross allowed himself to wonder, just barely, whether the story he had believed for so long had ever actually been true at all. Damien did not sleep that night. He sat in his study long after returning to Ravenwood. The fire burned low in the hearth. A glass of scotch untouched on the desk in front of him, and let himself remember, for the first time in 25 years, the woman he had spent a quarter century training himself never to think about. Isabel Reyes had been 22 when he met her, working a summer job at a small bookshop 3 blocks from the docks his family controlled, entirely unconnected to his world. Entirely unafraid of him in a way that had, at the time, felt like the rarest thing he'd ever encountered. He was 24, not yet the man he would become, still learning the weight of an inheritance his father had begun preparing him for since childhood. They had loved each other with the particular, reckless intensity of two people who both understood, somewhere underneath the happiness, that it couldn't last, not in his world, not with his father's expectations bearing down on every choice Damien made. They had gotten the tattoos together on a warm October night. A small shop. A design Damien had sketched himself. A compass rose wrapped around a flame meaning, in the private language only they'd ever spoken, I'll always find my way back to you. 6 months later, she was gone. Vincent Salgado, 28 at the time and already Damien's most trusted advisor, had come to him with the news, his face carrying the particular gravity of a man delivering something he clearly wished he didn't have to. Isabel had taken money, a significant sum, from a rival family in exchange for information about Damien's operations. She had disappeared the same week the money was confirmed missing from a rival account. Vincent had the documentation. Damien, 24 and freshly grieving a father who died only months earlier, had believed him completely, because there had been no reason not to, because Vincent had never once given him cause to doubt his loyalty in 15 years since. Damien had buried the grief the way he buried everything that threatened his control, deep, silent, sealed behind 25 years of careful, guarded power. He had built an empire. He had never once looked for her again. He had told himself, in the rare moments the memory surfaced anyway, that some griefs were simply meant to be carried rather than resolved. Now, sitting in his study at 4 in the morning with a stranger's casual observation about a tattoo replaying endlessly in his mind, he reached for his phone and called the one man he trusted with information delicate enough to require absolute discretion. Marcus, Damien said, I need everything you can find on a woman named Isabel Reyes. Quietly. Tonight, if possible. It took less than 6 hours. Marcus arrived at Ravenwood just after 10 with a thin folder, his expression carrying the particular carefulness of a man who sensed, without being told, that this request carried weight beyond its size. She's been living under a slightly altered version of her name for over 2 decades, Marcus said, setting the folder down. Isabel Reyes Mora, technically, though she dropped the second half years ago. Modest apartment on the east side. Works odd jobs when her health allows it. Her daughter, Maya, waits tables at a diner off Route 9 to cover the difference. Damien opened the folder slowly. A photograph, recent, grainy Isabel, older now. The same face he remembered, aged, gently round eyes that still carried the same quiet steadiness he'd fallen for at 22. There's no record of any payment from a rival family, Marcus continued carefully. No unexplained sums, no connection to anyone we've ever tracked as hostile. If she took money 25 years ago the way you were told, boss, there's no financial trail supporting it. Not one I can find. And I've looked at records considerably harder to access than this. Damien's jaw tightened. Vincent had documentation. I'm not saying the documentation was fake, Marcus said carefully. I'm saying 25 years later, none of the money it described seems to have ever actually existed anywhere I can trace. Damien sat with that for a long moment, an old, unwelcome suspicion beginning to take shape at the edges of a story he'd carried, unquestioned, for a quarter century. The daughter, he said finally. Maya. What do you have on her birth records? Marcus turned to the second page, and Damien watched his expression shift, careful and deliberate. The way a man's face changes when he understands he's about to hand someone information that will matter considerably more than a routine background check ever should. Born June the 14th, Marcus said quietly. 24 years ago. Damien's hand went very still against the folder. Isabel had disappeared in early October, 25 years ago. He remembered the date the way a person remembers the exact hour a war began, because it had ended everything that came before it. He counted backward, the math arriving with a cold, terrible clarity he hadn't let himself consider until this exact moment. If Isabel had disappeared in October, and Maya had been born the following June, Isabel had left carrying a child Damien never knew existed at all. He stared at the birth record for a long time, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. Marcus watching him with the careful patience of a man who understood he'd just handed his employer something considerably larger than a routine investigation. Boss, Marcus said quietly. Are you all right? Damien did not answer immediately. He set the folder down slowly, his hands, steady through 25 years of danger and negotiation, trembling faintly against the desk. If the dates are correct, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, this girl was born at exactly the time I lost her mother. Damien returned to the diner 4 times over the following 2 weeks. He told himself, each time, that he was simply confirming a suspicion, gathering the pieces methodically the way he approached everything that mattered. But by the 3rd visit, sitting at the same counter stool, asking Maya small, careful questions about her mother's health, her childhood, whether Isabel had ever mentioned a life before Maya was born, he understood he had stopped behaving like a man conducting an investigation and started behaving like a man who could not stay away. Maya noticed. She noticed everything. The particular sharpness of someone who'd spent a difficult life learning to read people quickly, out of necessity rather than curiosity. You're doing it again, she said, on his 4th visit, setting down his coffee with more force than the cup required. Asking about my mom. Watching me like you're waiting for me to say something specific. She crossed her arms, tired but unwilling to let it go this time. Who are you? Why do you keep coming here? Damien considered, for a long moment, telling her everything. He decided against it, not out of cruelty, but because he did not yet have enough certainty to hand a stranger a truth this devastating. I knew your mother once, he said instead, carefully. A long time ago. I didn't expect to run into anyone connected to her again. That's not really an answer, Maya said. It's the only one I can give you right now, Damien said. And something in the plain honesty of it seemed to disarm her more than a lie would have. That same evening, Maya mentioned the strange, intense customer to her mother almost as an afterthought, describing him, the coat, the tattoo he'd frozen over. The questions about Isabel's health and her past. Isabel Reyes went very still over the kitchen sink, her hands gripping the counter's edge until her knuckles whitened. What did he look like? She asked, her voice carrying a tightness Maya had never heard from her mother before. Maya described him as best she could. Isabel said nothing for a long moment, staring at nothing, an old fear rising in her chest that she had spent 25 years believing she'd successfully buried. That night, once Maya had gone to bed, Isabel opened a drawer she rarely touched and drew out a small, worn photograph, herself, 22 years old, standing beside a man whose face had been carefully, deliberately torn from the image years ago. She stared at the torn edge for a long time, her free hand pressed against her own tattoo. The compass rose in flame she had never once explained to her daughter. Across the city, Vincent Salgado received a report that unsettled him more than anything had in over 2 decades. Someone's been pulling old files, his contact said quietly. Financial records connected to the Reyes situation 25 years back. The request traced back to Damien's own security team. Vincent sat with that information for a long moment, an old, careful calculation moving behind his composed exterior. He had spent 25 years ensuring Damien never had reason to look backward, that the story he delivered as fact all those years ago remained exactly as settled as it had been the day he told it. If Damien was looking now, after all this time, something had disturbed the careful stillness Vincent had spent a quarter of a century maintaining. "Watch the situation," Vincent said finally. Quietly. "If it becomes necessary, we'll handle it the way we handled it the first time." 3 days later, Isabel's heart, already weakened by years of quiet, unspoken stress she'd never fully explained to her daughter, gave out during a grocery run, collapsing in the parking lot in a way that terrified Maya more than anything in her 24 years. At the hospital, waiting for word on whether her mother would stabilize, Maya called the only number she had for the strange man who'd once known her, a business card he'd left, almost as an afterthought, on his last visit to the diner. She didn't fully understand why she called him. She only knew, somehow, that whatever connected him to her mother mattered more than she'd let herself admit. Damien arrived within the hour, and when Isabel finally regained enough strength to speak, her eyes found him standing in the doorway of her hospital room, and something passed across her face that Maya had never seen before, not confusion, not surprise, but a raw, aching recognition that told Maya, watching closely despite her exhaustion, that this stranger and her mother's history ran considerably deeper than a passing acquaintance from years ago. "Damien," Isabel whispered, and the name alone seemed to cost her everything she had left. Maya went very still. Isabel reached weakly for her daughter's hand, her voice thin but suddenly, desperately urgent. 25 years of silence finally breaking apart all at once. "Maya," she said, "there's something I should have told you a long time ago. About your father. He isn't who I let you believe he was all these years, and I need you to understand why I." The monitor beside her bed spiked sharply, an alarm cutting through the room, medical staff rushing in before Isabel could finish the sentence. The name caught somewhere between her lips and the sudden chaos of nurses and machines, leaving Maya standing frozen beside the bed, staring at a mother who had just tried and failed to finally tell her the truth. Isabel stabilized within the hour, but the sentence she'd nearly finished still hung over the room like something unfinished in the air itself. Damien did not leave. He stood near the window while doctors worked, watching the steady green line of the monitor with an attention that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with the fact that the woman in that bed had almost said his daughter's name and his own in the same breath, and he had not been ready for either. When the room finally cleared and Maya was allowed back inside, exhausted and pale, she found him exactly where he'd been standing, still and silent. "You need to tell me what's happening," Maya said, her voice raw. "Right now." She looked at you like she'd seen a ghost. "I think your mother and I need to speak first," Damien said carefully. "Alone, if she's willing. After that, you'll hear everything." Maya wanted to refuse, but something in Isabel's tired, pleading eyes made her step back into the hallway, arms crossed, waiting. What passed between Damien and Isabel in the hour that followed rewrote 25 years of grief for both of them. Isabel spoke slowly, choosing each word the way a person chooses steps across ice that has already broken once before. "Vincent came to me 3 weeks before I left," she said. "Careful. Kind almost at first. He told me you knew about the pregnancy." Damien went very still. "I didn't know you were pregnant, Isabel." "I never knew." "I understand that now," she said quietly. "I didn't understand it then. He told me you'd found out, and that it had frightened you. Not the child itself," he said, "but what it meant. An airborne outside the family's planning. Complications with the council. He said you'd already decided it couldn't be allowed to happen." "You believed I wanted our child gone," Damien said. It wasn't an accusation. It barely came out as a sentence at all. "He showed me documents," Isabel continued, her hand gripping the edge of the blanket. "Something with your signature on it, close enough that a terrified 22-year-old had no way to know it wasn't real. He told me if I wanted to protect what I was carrying, I needed to disappear that night. No calls, no letters, nothing that could ever lead back to either of us. Damien said nothing. He was doing the math without wanting to, the same math that had first unsettled him at a diner counter 3 weeks ago, resurfacing now with a weight he hadn't been prepared to carry twice. When I left, Isabel said, watching his face carefully, I already suspected. I wasn't certain yet, not fully. But by the time I understood for sure, it was already too late to go back and ask you anything at all. Maya, Damien said quietly. It wasn't quite a question. Isabel nodded. She was born the following June. You never knew because Vincent made certain you never could. For a long moment, Damien did not speak. He was remembering, without meaning to, small things from 25 years ago he had never once let himself revisit. A hand pressed absently against her stomach one morning he had assumed was simple tiredness. A doctor's appointment mentioned once, vaguely, that he'd never thought to ask about again. A tattoo. A face at a diner counter. A number, 24, that had already unsettled him weeks before he understood why. She's mine, he said finally, her existence landing in his chest like something enormous finally given a shape. She's yours, Isabel confirmed. She always was. Damien sat with that for a long time, the full shape of it settling over him with a slow, devastating weight. Vincent had told him the opposite 25 years ago, that Isabel had taken money, betrayed him, vanished rather than face what she'd done. Two people who had loved each other completely, each handed a story engineered with surgical precision to make certain neither ever went looking for the truth in the other's direction. And somewhere underneath both lies, a daughter neither of them had been allowed to raise. He did this to both of us, Damien said, more to himself than to her. And he made certain neither of us ever had a single reason to ask a second question. He became aware that his hands had begun to tremble, not with disorientation, but with something heavier. 24 years gone. Birthdays he never knew existed. A childhood he'd had no part in, because he had trusted the wrong man without ever once thinking to ask why. He sat with it until he trusted himself to say it aloud to Maya directly. Her reaction, when he finally told her, was not gratitude. It was not relief. Say that again, she said quietly, as though giving him a chance to take it back. You're my daughter, Damien said. Your mother has just told me everything, Maya. I didn't know you existed until 3 weeks ago. You don't get to fix 24 years with a sentence, Maya said, her voice shaking, fury and grief tangled together. My mother worked 3 jobs when I was in high school. She missed my graduation because she was too sick to stand for 2 hours and too proud to tell anyone why. I used to lie awake, wondering what was wrong with me that my father never once looked for us. Her eyes were wet, but her voice stayed hard. And you were what? A few miles away this whole time? Running an empire? Never once looking? I believed your mother took money and disappeared, Damien said. I had no reason to look for a child that I didn't know existed. That's supposed to help, Maya said. It wasn't a question. No, Damien admitted. It's just the truth. I can't give you back the years you lost, Maya. I can only tell you what actually happened, and ask whether you'll let me be here now. Something in his flat, unflinching honesty seemed to cost Maya the momentum of her anger, if only for a moment. Not forgiveness, nothing close to it, but a small crack in the certainty that he was simply another lie waiting to unravel. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with any of this, she said finally, quieter now. Neither do I, Damien said. But I'd like the chance to find out, if you'll let me. Before Maya could answer, his phone rang, sharp in the quiet corridor. He stepped away to take it, and when he turned back, the raw, unguarded man from a moment ago had been replaced by something colder. That was Marcus, he said. Vincent knows I've been pulling old files. He knows the timeline connects back to your mother. Damien's jaw tightened. And now he knows about you too. Not just that you exist. That I've found you. Maya's breath caught. What does that mean? It means, Damien said quietly, the man who separated me from your mother 25 years ago has just learned that the daughter he made certain I never found is standing in a hospital hallway 3 miles from where he sleeps tonight. Maya did not sleep that night, and neither did Damien. He'd offered to move her and Isabel to Ravenwood immediately, full security, medical staff on call. Distance from anywhere Vincent might think to look. Maya refused at first, some stubborn instinct telling her that accepting his protection meant accepting everything else too quickly, before she'd had time to decide any of it on her own terms. I'm not asking you to accept me as your father tonight, Damien said quietly. standing in the corridor at 2 in the morning while Isabel slept behind them. I'm asking you to let me keep you both alive long enough to decide what you actually want, once the danger isn't standing over you. Maya studied him for a long moment. The careful stillness that she now understood wasn't simply personality, but the discipline of a man who'd spent 25 years training himself not to feel things too visibly. Fine, she said finally.
For her.
Not for me. They moved that same night. The days that followed settled into something unsteady. Isabel recovered slowly in a guest wing grander than anything she'd lived in for 25 years. Maya wandered the estate's halls wary and unsettled, unsure whether she was a guest or something else entirely. Damien gave her space even when every instinct told him to close the distance faster than she was ready for. He found her in the library one evening, a sketchbook open on the table in front of her, though she wasn't drawing anything. You used to draw, he said. Your mother mentioned it. I stopped, Maya said, not looking up. Around the time we couldn't afford the supplies, and I picked up extra shifts instead. Damien said nothing to that. He didn't need to. The silence carried the weight on its own. The next evening, he noticed her humming while she set the table for dinner, an old, half-remembered melody, unconscious, absent-minded. He recognized it instantly. Isabel used to hum the same 3 notes 25 years ago, cooking in a kitchen that no longer existed in either of their lives. He said nothing about it. He only stood in the doorway a moment longer than necessary, something tightening quietly in his chest. You keep watching me like I'm going to disappear, Maya said one night, catching him at it. Old habit, Damien admitted. I spent 24 years assuming I'd never see you at all. I haven't fully adjusted to the alternative. Something in his voice, steady, unguarded in a way she still wasn't used to, made Maya set her fork down. You're not what I expected, she said. Everyone at the diner used to whisper about men like you. Powerful. Cold. I keep waiting for that version of you to show up. He exists, Damien said honestly. I won't pretend otherwise. But he's never had a reason to show up around you, and I intend to keep it that way. Isabel, healing steadily, found her own version of peace in the quiet evenings she and Damien spent talking, not romance. Neither of them reaching for what had been lost 25 years ago, but something closer to two people finally allowed to grieve the same wound together instead of alone. I used to hate you, Isabel admitted one evening, sitting across from him in the estate's small sitting room. For 25 years. It's strange, discovering a person you hated never actually did anything to deserve it. I hated a version of you too, Damien said. One that never existed. I think Vincent understood exactly how easy that would be for both of us. Beneath the fragile, careful peace settling over Ravenwood, something else was quietly moving. Marcus arrived at Damien's study 3 days later, his expression carrying a grimness that made Damien set down the report in his hands before Marcus said a single word. One of our people flagged unusual activity near the diner, Marcus said. 2 men asking questions about Maya. When the staff said she'd quit without notice, they didn't push. They just left. That's not like Vincent, Damien said slowly. He doesn't send men to ask questions and walk away. No, Marcus agreed, which means he already knew the answer before he asked. He wasn't gathering information, boss. He was confirming what he already suspected, that you'd moved her somewhere secure. Damien's jaw tightened. How would he know that? Marcus hesitated, and the hesitation told Damien more than the words that followed. I've been running a quiet audit on the household staff since the hospital. There's a discrepancy in the outer perimeter logs from 2 nights ago, a maintenance override that shouldn't have existed, time-stamped during the overnight shift change. I haven't confirmed who authorized it yet. Someone inside, Damien said. Possibly, Marcus said. I'm not going to guess a name I can't prove yet. But boss, if there's a gap in that perimeter, and Vincent already suspects Maya is here, it's only a matter of time before he tests it. Damien sat with that a long moment, an old, familiar coldness settling into him. The particular focus he hadn't needed in years, the version of himself that had built an empire out of exactly this kind of calculation. Tighten everything, he said. Every access point, every log, every override capability. And Marcus, I don't care what it costs the household's convenience. Nobody moves through this estate without being accounted for twice. That evening, walking the garden path with Maya for the first time since she'd arrived, Damien tried, carefully, to explain the shape of the danger without frightening her more than the truth required. You're not being paranoid, Maya said, reading his hesitation correctly. You think he's going to try something. I think a man who's protected a 25-year lie doesn't simply let it collapse because I found the truth, Damien said. I think he's going to try to make sure it never gets the chance to be spoken anywhere that matters. And if he does, Maya said. What then? Damien was quiet for a long moment, weighing an answer heavier than she yet understood. Then I stopped protecting my position, he said, and I start protecting the only two people who've ever mattered more to me than it did. 3 days later, the reason arrived. Isabel was walking the garden stone path alone, the first real solitude she'd allowed herself since her collapse, when two men in plain clothes stepped from behind the old hedge line near the eastern wall. A breach that should have been impossible and wasn't, because the override Marcus had flagged 2 nights earlier had never actually been closed. Isabel's scream tore across the grounds just as the perimeter alarm finally caught up to what had already happened. Damien broke into a run he hadn't allowed himself in years, adrenaline and fear colliding into something sharper than either. He rounded the hedge in time to see one man dragging Isabel toward the wall, her feet losing purchase on the gravel, and the second man turning, weapon rising, steady, aimed directly at the sound of Damien's approach. For one suspended half-second, everything went very still. Damien understood, with a cold and absolute clarity, exactly what choice stood in front of him now. Not a decision he would have time to make carefully, the way he'd made every decision that built his empire, but one he would have to make in the space of a single breath, knowing that whatever he chose in the next instant would decide who walked out of that garden and who didn't. The weapon rose, and Damien moved. There was no time to think, only the old, buried instinct of a man who had survived 25 years in a world that punished hesitation. He closed the distance in 2 strides and drove his shoulder into the gunman's ribs a half-second before the trigger finished pulling, the shot going wide, burying itself somewhere in the hedge instead of in him. They went down together onto the gravel, the impact tearing the weapon loose between them. Damien's hand found it first. His knee found the man's wrist a moment later, pinning it hard against the stone path. Isabel screamed again, the second attacker still gripping her arm, dragging her back toward the wall, her feet losing purchase on the loose gravel. Damien rose in one motion, the recovered weapon steady in his hand, and for the first time in years, the version of him that the rest of his world feared surfaced completely, not performed, not calculated for effect, simply present. "Let her go," he said. His voice carried none of the wild adrenaline still roaring through his chest, only a flat, absolute stillness. "You have exactly one chance to walk out of this garden. I would not waste it deciding whether I'm serious." The man hesitated, weighing the odds the way men in his line of work were trained to, and released Isabel's arm. She stumbled forward, catching herself against the low stone wall, and Damien crossed to her in 3 steps, positioning his own body between her and both men without ever lowering the weapon. The man he disarmed tried to rise. Damien brought the weapon down, not to fire, but hard across the man's temple, enough to drop him, not enough to kill him. He stood over him for one long, charged second, breathing hard, every old instinct telling him how easy the rest would be. He did not take it further. He had spent 25 years believing that fear was the only currency that kept a man safe. Standing in that garden, his daughter's mother trembling behind him, he understood, clearly for the first time, that killing this man would not undo a single hour of what had already been stolen. It would only prove Vincent right about exactly the kind of man Damien was capable of becoming. Marcus's team arrived seconds later, security finally catching up to a breach that should never have existed. Both men were restrained, disarmed, and separated for questioning within minutes. Damien knelt beside Isabel, checking her over with hands that had gone, in the space of a single breath, from lethal to careful. "I'm all right," she said, shaking but unhurt, her fingers gripping his forearm. "Damien." "I'm all right." He held her gaze a moment longer than necessary, something old and complicated passing between them, not romance, but the particular relief of a man who had once lost her completely, given, impossibly, a second chance not to lose her again. Maya reached them moments later, having run the length of the garden the instant she heard the scream. She stopped short at the sight in front of her, her mother alive and shaking, 2 subdued men on the ground, and her father standing over all of it with an expression that had nothing to do with the careful, guarded man she'd spent the last weeks learning to trust in small, cautious increments. For the first time, she saw exactly who the rest of the world feared. She said nothing in the moment. But something in the way she looked at him afterward, not frightened, but recalculating, told Damien that whatever she just witnessed had changed something in how she understood him, though not yet in a way either of them could name. It took Marcus's team less than a day to confirm what the breach had already suggested. The compromised perimeter override traced back to a junior security employee with gambling debts considerably larger than his salary could cover, recruited months earlier, planted quietly, and activated only when Vincent needed him. The two captured men, faced with the particular consequences Damien's world reserved for failure, gave up what they knew within hours. It wasn't everything. Vincent, they confirmed, had anticipated exactly this outcome and had already begun moving, financial records quietly restructured. A longtime assistant instructed to destroy specific files, a car reportedly packed for a trip with no stated destination. "He's not running," Marcus said grimly, laying the update on Damien's desk 2 days later. "He's trying to erase what he can before you reach him. If we move too slowly, boss, there may not be enough left to prove anything in front of the council." "Then we move today," Damien said. What followed was not a manhunt. It was something more precise. Damien and Marcus assembling every surviving piece of evidence before Vincent could finish burying it. The forged documents Isabel had described from 25 years ago, recovered from a storage account Vincent had forgotten still existed under an old alias. The financial trail Marcus had originally found lacking, now explained by a second, hidden account structure the captured men's testimony helped expose, and the plain, undeniable fact of Maya herself, a truth no amount of destroyed paperwork could erase. Damien brought all of it before the full council 3 weeks later, in the same formal hall where Vincent had once stood at his side for 15 years, trusted completely. Vincent's composure held through the first several minutes. "I did what was necessary," he said. When Damien finally addressed him directly, the council silent around them. "You were young, reckless. That woman would have made this family vulnerable at the exact moment we couldn't afford weakness. Everything I did to protect what your father built." "You didn't protect anything," Damien said quietly. "You stole 24 years from a woman who never wronged me, and 24 years from a daughter who grew up believing her father simply never wanted her. Whatever war you think you were fighting, Vincent, there was no version of it that required that price." "She was a liability," Vincent said, his voice sharpening, the mask finally cracking. "I made a decision that kept this family stable for a quarter century. You'd have destroyed everything for a woman you barely—" "That's enough," one of the older council members said quietly, something in his tone suggesting the argument had already lost the room. It had. The evidence, laid out plainly across the table, did not require Damien to argue further. Vincent's own carefully maintained reputation, the thing he had spent 25 years protecting more fiercely than anything else, collapsed within the hour, stripped of position and standing, handed to consequences considerably more measured than Damien might once have chosen, but final all the same. Damien did not kill him. He understood, standing in that hall, that Vincent's power had always depended on controlling the truth, deciding what Damien knew, what Isabel believed, what the council was told. The only punishment that actually mattered was making certain the truth could never again be his to control. The weeks that followed moved slower, gentler, than anything Damien had known in 25 years. Isabel's recovery continued steadily, strong enough by early autumn to sit in Ravenwood's garden without needing anyone beside her, though Damien still found himself checking on her more often than necessity required, a habit neither of them tried too hard to explain. Maya's anger did not disappear overnight. It softened instead, slowly, through small, unglamorous moments, rather than one dramatic reconciliation. Damien left a set of art supplies on the library table one afternoon, said nothing about it, and simply waited. A week later, she began drawing again, tentative at first, then steadier. One evening, she left a sketch on his desk without a word before disappearing upstairs. It was his own face, drawn with more care than she probably meant to admit. "It's not very good," she said, the next morning, when he found her in the kitchen. "It's the only portrait anyone's ever made of me that wasn't for a file," Damien said. "I think it might be the best one I own." Something eased in her at that. Not full forgiveness, not yet, but the beginning of something that no longer required bracing for disappointment every time he walked into a room. On a bright afternoon in early November, months after a chance remark about a tattoo had first cracked open 25 years of buried grief, Maya walked into the diner where she'd once worked, not out of necessity anymore, but because some places deserve to be visited on purpose rather than simply left behind. Damien was already there, waiting at the same counter stool where they'd first met, out of place in his understated coat exactly as he'd been the night everything began. "You didn't have to come here," Maya said, sliding onto the stool beside him. "I wanted to," Damien said. "This is where I found you." It felt wrong to let it just become a place I used to visit. Maya studied him for a long moment, something warm and finally, genuinely unguarded settling into her expression. "Dad," she said quietly, the word tentative, new, entirely unrehearsed, and all the more powerful for it. Damien said nothing for a moment. He simply looked at her, 25 years of grief and 3 months of careful, uncertain rebuilding arriving all at once in a single, ordinary word he had long since stopped believing he would ever hear. "I would have waited considerably longer than a few difficult months," he said finally, his voice rough, "for exactly that. 24 years could not be returned. No amount of money, no confession, no reckoning with the man responsible would ever give Damien back a single birthday, a single ordinary Tuesday, a single small moment he'd missed simply because he trusted the wrong man with the truth." But sitting in that diner, beside the daughter who had just called him something he'd never expected to earn, Damien understood that being late was not the same as being too late, that some families are not lost, only delayed, waiting quietly for the truth to finally catch up to them. If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe for more emotional Mafia family stories. Do you think Maya was right to give Damien a chance, even after everything he unknowingly missed?